Ambassador Jake Matthews had been standing in the Galactic Council chamber for almost 3 hours, and his feet were killing him. The marble floor was beautiful, sure, covered in patterns that seemed to shift and glow under the alien lighting, but it was also cold and unforgiving. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying not to look as uncomfortable as he felt. Around him, representatives from dozens of alien species filled the massive hall. Some floated in containment fields, others stood on platforms adjusted to their gravity needs, and a few were completely unrecognizable as living beings. Jake had been doing this job for 2 years now, and he still got a little startled when someone who looked like a cloud of purple gas suddenly spoke in perfect English through a translator device. The Rigarians, though, they were hard to miss. They stood at the front of the chamber on an elevated platform that made sure everyone had to look up at them. Typical. Prince Vorith was addressing the council, and even Jake had to admit the guy was impressive looking by alien standards. His skin was made of some kind of translucent crystal that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls. His features were perfectly symmetrical, which apparently was a big deal in Rigarian culture. Everything about him screamed wealth, power, and superiority. Jake's translator earpiece crackled to life as the prince's speech shifted to Standard Galactic. Tom Bradford, Jake's assistant and the only other human in the room, leaned over and whispered, "Here it comes. The part about the alliance. Earth had been trying to secure a trade agreement with the Rigarian Empire for almost a year. Their star systems controlled the most efficient routes between Earth and the resource-rich outer colonies. Without access to those routes, Earth's ships had to take the long way around, adding weeks to every journey and millions of dollars in fuel costs. The Rigarians knew this, of course, and they'd been jerking Earth around for months, dangling the agreement just out of reach while demanding more and more concessions. Prince Vorith's voice rang out across the chamber, smooth and confident. "The Rigarian Empire values all members of the Galactic Council equally," he said, and Jake had to stop himself from snorting. That was rich coming from a species that literally ranked other races on a beauty scale. "Therefore, I am pleased to announce that we have found a way to strengthen our bonds with the human delegation." Jake felt his stomach drop. This didn't sound good. Tom grabbed his arm, suddenly tense. "As you all know," the prince continued, "my beloved sister, Lady Chris, suffered a tragic accident last cycle. A shuttle malfunction resulted in the complete loss of her vision." There was a murmur of sympathy from the assembled delegates, though Jake noticed it sounded pretty rehearsed. "She has borne this burden with grace, though of course her prospects for a traditional union have been compromised." Oh no. Jake knew where this was going and he didn't like it one bit. Prince Vorith turned to look directly at Jake, and his crystalline features arranged themselves into what might have been a smile. It was hard to tell with aliens sometimes. "In the spirit of cooperation and mutual benefit, I propose a marriage alliance between Lady Chris and Ambassador Matthews. This will bind our peoples together in a way that transcends mere commercial agreements." The chamber erupted in chatter. Jake heard gasps, whispers, and what sounded like laughter from some of the other delegations. His translator was going crazy trying to keep up with all the different languages being spoken at once. Tom was practically vibrating with anger beside him. "He can't be serious," he hissed. "This is completely inappropriate." But Prince Vorith wasn't done. He raised one elegant hand, and the chamber fell silent again. "I know some may question this match," he said, and now there was definitely amusement in his voice. "The Rigarian people are known throughout the galaxy for our appreciation of beauty and aesthetic perfection. Humans, forgive me for speaking plainly, do not meet our usual standards." Jake felt heat creeping up his neck. He'd heard this kind of thing before. Humans were considered pretty ugly by Galactic Council standards. No glowing skin, no interesting colors, no special features. Just regular flesh and bone and hair. The first time a Rigarian had seen a human, they'd apparently needed medical attention for the shock. "However," the prince continued and his smile widened, "my dear sister can no longer see. She cannot perceive the physical imperfections that would normally make such a union impossible for a member of the royal family. Therefore this arrangement is ideal. She will not have to look upon features that might cause her distress, and your people will gain the alliance they so desperately need." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake could feel every eye in the chamber on him, waiting to see how he would react. Some of the other delegates looked sympathetic. Others looked like they were trying not to laugh. The Rigarian delegation, clustered around their prince, radiated smug satisfaction. Tom was pulling on his sleeve. "Say no," he whispered urgently. "Jake, you can't agree to this. It's degrading. It's insulting to you and to Earth." And Tom was right. Everything about this was designed to humiliate humanity. The prince was essentially saying his blind sister was too good to look at a human, but since she couldn't see anyway, she might as well marry one. It was the kind of insult that would normally end diplomatic talks immediately. But Jake was thinking about the trade routes. He was thinking about the colony ships that were struggling to make it to the outer systems. He was thinking about the resources Earth needed to support its growing population. He was thinking about the fact that the Rigarians knew all of this and were using it as leverage. He stepped forward, and his footsteps echoed in the quiet chamber. "Prince Vorith," he said, and he was proud that his voice came out steady and calm. "Your proposal is unexpected." "I'm sure it is," the prince replied, and there was no mistaking the mockery in his tone now. Jake took a breath. This was probably going to be the worst decision of his career, but he couldn't see another way forward. "I accept your offer," he said. "On one condition. I want to meet Lady Chris first. Before any contracts are signed or announcements are made, I want to speak with her." Prince Vorith's crystalline eyebrows rose slightly. "You wish to meet her? Whatever for?" "I assure you, she has been informed of the arrangement and has agreed." "I'm sure she has," Jake said. "But where I come from, people who are getting married usually meet each other first. Call it a human custom." For a moment, Jake thought the prince might refuse. But then he laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. "How quaint." "Very well, Ambassador. You may meet your bride-to-be. Though I warn you, the accident has left her quite changed. She is not the gentle creature she once was. In fact, her temperament has become rather sharp. Another reason why a human match is suitable." Jake ignored the fresh insult. "When can I see her?" "Tomorrow in her private gardens. I will have my staff arrange it." The prince turned back to the council. "Then it is settled. The Rigarian Empire and Earth will be united through marriage." As the chamber erupted in discussion again, Tom pulled Jake aside. "Are you insane?" he demanded. "Do you know what you just agreed to?" Jake watched Prince Vorith and his delegation leave the chamber, their crystalline skin glittering like they'd just won the lottery. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I agreed to marry a woman I've never met to save an alliance with people who think we're too ugly to look at. But something about this doesn't add up, Tom." "What do you mean?" The prince seemed too happy. Too eager. Like he's getting more out of this than just dumping his blind sister on the ugly humans. Jake rubbed his face tiredly. "I want a full background check on Lady Chris. And I want our intelligence people to dig into every communication the Rigarians have made in the last 6 months. Something's off here." Tom nodded slowly. "You think this is about more than just the trade routes?" "I think," Jake said, watching the last of the delegates file out of the chamber, "that Prince Vorith just made a mistake. He underestimated us because he thinks we're desperate and ugly. But desperate people pay attention. And I'm going to find out exactly what game he's playing." The Rigarian Palace Gardens were like something out of a dream, or maybe a really expensive botanical museum. Jake walked along a path made of smooth white stones that seemed to glow faintly in the alien sunlight. On either side of him, plants from what had to be a dozen different worlds created a riot of colors and smells. Some of the flowers were normal enough, at least in shape, but others defied description. One plant nearby looked like it was made of living glass, its leaves chiming softly when the breeze touched them. Tom had wanted to come with him, but the Rigarian guards had been very clear. Ambassador Matthews was to meet Lady Chris alone. No security detail, no assistants, no recording devices. Just him and his future wife, having a nice private chat in the garden. Jake had agreed, though he'd made sure to memorize the location of every exit he could spot on the way in. He found her sitting beside a fountain that flowed upward instead of down, the water defying gravity in a way that made his engineer brain hurt. She was smaller than her brother, her crystalline skin a deeper shade of purple rather than the prince's pale blue. She wore a simple white dress that somehow made her look more elegant than all the fancy robes he'd seen on the other Rigarian nobles. What struck him most, though, was that she wore no jewelry, no decorative lights, none of the glowing accessories that seemed to be standard fashion here. She didn't turn when he approached, even though his footsteps on the stone path weren't exactly quiet. "You're the human," she said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. It wasn't a question. "I can smell you from here." Fear mixed with something else. Curiosity, maybe? Jake stopped a few feet away from her, suddenly aware that he probably did smell different to her. Humans and Rigarians had completely different biology. "Ambassador Jake Matthews," he said. "Though I guess fiancé might be more accurate at this point." She laughed, and it caught him completely off guard. It wasn't the polite, rehearsed sound he'd heard from other Rigarians. It was genuine, almost warm. He really did it, didn't he? My dear brother actually stood up in front of the entire Galactic Council and said you could marry me because I can't see how ugly you are. Pretty much word for word, yeah. Lady Chris stood up in one smooth motion, and Jake noticed how easily she moved. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in her movements despite her blindness. She tilted her head slightly, like she was studying him, though her eyes remained unfocused. I'm Chris, by the way. No need for the lady nonsense when we're alone. Tell me something, Jake. Are you really as hideous as my people claim? Jake had to smile at that. There was something refreshing about her directness. By Regarian standards? Absolutely. I don't have the crystal skin thing going on, no glowing parts, no symmetrical perfection. Just regular skin, brown eyes, brown hair. Pretty boring actually. And by human standards? He shrugged, then realized she couldn't see it. Average, I guess. Maybe a little below. I've got a nose that's been broken twice from boxing when I was younger, never healed quite straight. Scar through my left eyebrow from a dumb skateboarding accident when I was 15. My ears stick out a bit more than they should. Nothing special. Chris moved toward him and Jake held very still as she reached out. Her fingers found his shoulder first, then moved up to his face. Her touch was light, almost clinical at first, like she was reading Braille. She traced the bridge of his nose, pausing where it bent slightly to the left. Her fingers followed the line of his jaw, touched the scar on his eyebrow, even checked his ears. You feel like someone who's actually lived, she said thoughtfully. My people are obsessed with perfection. Any flaw, any imperfection, we fix it surgically before it becomes permanent. I haven't touched an honest face in years. Everyone feels the same. Smooth. Perfect. Boring. She stepped back and Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. There was something intense about having someone examine your face like that, especially when you knew they were creating a mental picture of you from touch alone. Can I ask you something? Jake said. Why are you going along with this? Your brother basically offered you up like a political bargaining chip. You're royalty. You've got to have some say in this. Chris walked back to the fountain and sat down on its edge. She patted the space next to her and Jake joined her. Tell me why you accepted first, she said. And don't give me the diplomatic answer about Earth needing the trade routes. I want the real reason. Jake thought about lying, about giving her exactly the diplomatic answer she just told him not to use. But something about her made him want to be honest. Okay, real answer? I was curious. Your brother stood up there and basically said you were damaged goods that he needed to get rid of. He spoke about you like you were an embarrassment, a problem to be solved. And I thought to myself, what kind of woman makes a guy like Prince Vorith that eager to marry her off to someone he considers beneath him? What's he so afraid of? Chris smiled, and this time it had teeth. Literally. Regarians had way more teeth than humans and they were all sharp. Good answer. You're smarter than Vorith gave you credit for. Now let me tell you a secret, Jake. I'm not nearly as helpless as my dear brother thinks I am. She stood up and walked a few steps away, navigating around a plant that Jake barely saw in time to avoid himself. When I lost my sight in the shuttle accident, everyone assumed I'd become useless. In Regarian culture, we value visual beauty above almost everything else. How can you appreciate art if you can't see it? How can you judge worth if you can't observe perfection? She turned back toward him, her unfocused eyes somehow still managing to feel like they were looking right through him. But they forgot something. Regarians don't just have sight. We have other senses, and mine have been surgically enhanced since the accident. Enhanced how? I can hear your heartbeat from here, she said casually. It's elevated, by the way. Nervous or attracted, I'm not sure which yet. I can smell the soap you used this morning, the coffee you had for breakfast, the slight tang of anxiety in your sweat. I can feel the electrical field your body generates, the way you shift your weight when you're uncertain. She walked back to him, moving with perfect confidence despite the obstacles in her path. I can detect lies, Jake. When someone's lying, their heart rate changes. Their breathing shifts. Their skin temperature fluctuates. It's very useful in politics. Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. That's incredible. Does your brother know? Vorith? He knows I had the enhancements, but he thinks they're just a poor replacement for sight. He doesn't understand that in some ways I can perceive more than he ever could. She sat down next to Jake again, closer this time. Now, want to know the real reason I'm going along with this marriage? Please. Because I've been listening to my brother when he thinks I can't hear him. My hearing is good enough that I can pick up conversations through the walls of his private study. I can't understand the encrypted communications, but I know the sound of deception. I know the rhythm of a person planning something terrible. Her expression turned serious. Vorith is planning something against Earth, Jake. This alliance isn't what it seems. It's a trap. Jake felt his blood run cold. He'd suspected something was off, but hearing it confirmed was different. What kind of trap? I don't know all the details yet. The important conversations are too well protected. But I've heard him laughing about this marriage. Real laughter, not the fake political kind. He thinks marrying me off to you accomplishes two things. First, it removes me from the line of succession. I'm the older sibling, technically, but our laws say a disabled royal can be passed over. By marrying me to an outsider, he eliminates any claim I might have to the throne. And second, Chris turned toward him, and there was something fierce in her expression. Second, he gets to humiliate Earth in front of the entire Galactic Council while setting up whatever he's really planning. He thinks you're desperate enough to accept any terms, weak enough that you won't fight back, and ugly enough that marrying you to his blind sister is the ultimate insult. She reached out and found his hand, squeezing it firmly. What he doesn't know is that I've been waiting for an opportunity like this. Someone from outside Regarian politics, someone who might actually help me figure out what he's planning. Jake looked down at their joined hands, his plain human skin against her crystalline purple. You want to investigate your own brother? I want to stop him from doing something that could hurt a lot of people. Earth people, Regarian people, maybe others. She tilted her head. Question is, are you brave enough to help me? Because this won't be easy, and if we're caught, Vorith won't just call off the marriage. He'll make sure we both disappear. Jake thought about Tom's warning about how this whole thing was insulting and degrading. He thought about the safe option of just going through with the marriage, securing the trade routes, and keeping his head down. Then he thought about the woman sitting next to him, blind but not helpless, royal but not spoiled, willing to risk everything to do what was right. Yeah, he said. I'm in. Let's find out what your brother is really planning. Over the next 3 weeks, Jake's entire understanding of what it meant to be blind got turned completely upside down. He'd expected to be helping Chris, maybe guiding her around or acting as her eyes. Instead, he found himself struggling to keep up with someone who moved through the world with more confidence than most sighted people he knew. Their first real outing together was a formal dinner with several Regarian nobles. Jake had been dreading it, expecting awkward stares and whispered comments about the ugly human and the blind princess. What he got instead was a masterclass in political observation. They were seated at a long table carved from some kind of luminescent stone. Chris sat beside him, her posture relaxed, seemingly just another guest at the dinner. But throughout the meal she kept leaning close to whisper things in his ear. The ambassador from the Kelvin sector just lied about their trade numbers, she murmured during the second course. His heart rate jumped when he mentioned the export figures. How can you possibly know that? Jake whispered back. I can hear it. Listen. She was quiet for a moment. Your heart beats about 70 times a minute when you're calm. It's just spiked to over 100. Also, his temperature increased by 0.3 degrees. Thermal sensors in my skin. Jake looked at the ambassador in question, a crystalline being who looked perfectly composed. That's insane. You're like a walking lie detector. Better than a machine, Chris said with a small smile. Machines can be fooled. Biology doesn't lie. Later that week she took him on a walk through the palace. Not the public areas he'd seen before, but the service corridors and maintenance tunnels that staff used. In the dim lighting, Jake had to use his phone's flashlight to see where he was going. Chris just walked, her hand trailing along the wall occasionally but otherwise moving like she could see perfectly. How are you doing this? Jake asked, nearly tripping over a pipe that Chris had stepped over without breaking stride. Echolocation mostly. I had my vocal cords modified to produce sounds outside your hearing range. The echoes tell me where everything is. Also, I've memorized these tunnels. Every turn, every obstacle, every door. She stopped and turned back to him. I've been preparing, Jake. For years. Everyone thought I was just hiding away, being the tragic blind princess. Really, I was learning every corner of this palace. Why? Because I knew eventually Vorith would try something. He's ambitious, always has been. And I'm the only thing standing between him and absolute power. She started walking again. The accident that blinded me? It wasn't an accident. Not entirely. Jake felt his stomach drop. He tried to kill you? I can't prove it. But the shuttle that malfunctioned had just passed a safety inspection. The odds of a catastrophic failure were less than 1%. Anne Vorith was very insistent that I take that particular shuttle that day. Her voice was calm, but Jake could hear the anger underneath. I survived, obviously. But instead of trying again, he realized that a blind sister was better than a dead one. Dead, I might have been mourned. Blind, I could be dismissed. They were approaching a junction in the tunnel. Chris held up a hand and Jake stopped. She tilted her head, listening to something he couldn't hear. "Guard patrol," she whispered. "Two of them about 30 seconds away. Through that door." She pulled him into a side passage and sure enough, Jake heard footsteps approaching. Two Regarian guards walked past, their conversation about some sporting event fading as they continued down the corridor. "Okay, that was impressive," Jake admitted. "That was basic. Now, want to see what else I can do?" She led him through the tunnels until they reached a section near the administrative wing of the palace. Through a ventilation grate, Jake could see into what looked like a communications room. Several Regarian technicians were working at stations, their crystalline fingers dancing over holographic displays. "This is where they route all the palace communications," Chris explained, her voice barely a whisper. "Diplomatic channels, personal messages, everything. I come here sometimes to listen." "Listen to what?" "This." She closed her eyes, though Jake realized that was probably just habit. Her head tilted slightly and she seemed to focus on something. After a moment she started speaking, her voice mimicking one of the technicians perfectly. "Confirm receipt of shipment 774. Route through secondary channels. Authorization code Vorith Delta 9. Jake stared at her. "You can hear them from here? Through the wall? Enhanced hearing, remember? I can filter out background noise and focus on specific conversations. Been doing it for 2 years now." She turned her head slightly. "There. Different technician. He's accessing restricted files. I can hear the security clearance prompts." Over the following days, Chris taught Jake how to move quietly, how to observe without being observed, how to piece together information from fragments. But more importantly, she shared what she'd learned about her brother's activities. They met in her gardens every evening, the one place where they could talk freely without being monitored. Chris had confirmed that the gardens had no surveillance systems. Vorith considered them beneath notice, just like he considered his sister. "I've been tracking his meetings," Chris explained one evening. "He's been in contact with a group called the Purity Front. They're Regarian extremists who believe our species should dominate the Galactic Council completely." "I've heard of them," Jake said. "Our intelligence briefings mention them, but we thought they were just a fringe group. No real power. They're bigger than Earth knows. And Vorith has been feeding them resources, information, support." She pulled out a small data device. "I can't see visual data, but I can download it. This contains meeting schedules, financial transfers, all coded but traceable." Jake took the device carefully. "Where did you get this?" "Vorith's private study. I went in last night while he was at the theater. He locks his files behind biometric security, but the system makes a distinct sound pattern when it's accessed. I recorded that pattern months ago and had a friend in the tech division build me a bypass." She smiled slightly. "Being underestimated has its advantages. This is incredible, Chris. But I still don't understand the endgame. What's the Purity Front planning? That's what we need to figure out. But Jake, there's something else you should know." She reached out and found his hand. "I've been listening to your conversations too. With Tom, with your Earth intelligence contacts. I heard you report back about me." Jake felt his face flush with embarrassment. "I had to tell them something. They needed to know you weren't just some helpless." "I'm not offended," Chris interrupted. "You called me extraordinary. You told them I was the smartest person you'd ever worked with. You said marrying me might be the best decision you'd ever made, even if it started as a political arrangement." She squeezed his hand. "Was that true, or were you just filing a report?" Jake was quiet for a moment. Over these weeks, he'd started looking forward to his time with Chris. She was brilliant, funny, brave in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. She never complained about her blindness, never seemed to want pity. She just adapted and overcame and kept moving forward. "It was true," he said quietly. "Every word." "Good. Because we're going to need to trust each other completely for what comes next." She stood up, pulling him with her. "I think I've found where Vorith keeps his most sensitive files. The ones even his regular security systems don't protect. But they're in the palace's old archive section, 3 levels below ground. Very tight security. Very dangerous." "How dangerous are we talking?" "The kind where if we're caught, Vorith can claim we were saboteurs and have us executed without trial. Officially, of course, it would be a tragic accident. Just like my shuttle was a tragic accident." Jake thought about backing out. This was way beyond what he'd signed up for as an ambassador. This was espionage, maybe even treason against the Regarian royal family. But then he thought about what Tom had told him before he left Earth. The colony ships were struggling. People were dying because the long routes around Regarian space took too long. Earth needed this alliance, but not if it was a trap. "When do we go?" he asked. Chris's smile was fierce. "Tomorrow night. There's a state celebration. Everyone will be at the Grand Hall, including most of the security staff. It's our best chance. What do I need to do?" "Just keep up with me and do exactly what I say. I'll get us through the security. You'll need to access the file since I can't read visual displays. We get in, download everything, get out." Simple. That doesn't sound simple at all. "It's not," Chris admitted. "But Jake, whatever Vorith is planning involves Earth. I've heard enough fragments to know that much. This marriage, the alliance, all of it is building toward something. And if we don't find out what, a lot of people are going to get hurt." She was right, and they both knew it. Jake looked at this woman who couldn't see him, who'd been dismissed and underestimated her whole life, who was now planning to break into one of the most secure locations in the palace to stop her own brother from doing something terrible. "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow night. Let's find out what Prince Vorith is really up to." The state celebration was in full swing 3 floors above them, and Jake could hear the muffled sounds of music and voices through the palace walls. Down here in the maintenance tunnels, it was just him, Chris, and the quiet hum of environmental systems keeping the massive building running. Jake's hands were sweating inside the thin gloves Chris had given him. "No fingerprints," she'd explained earlier. "And they block thermal signatures. Basic spycraft. Basic spycraft." Right. Because that was totally normal for an ambassador's job description. They'd left the celebration separately, Jake claiming a headache and Chris saying she was tired. No one had questioned it. The blind princess getting overwhelmed at a loud party made perfect sense to everyone. Jake was learning that Chris used people's assumptions about her disability like a weapon. They expected weakness, so they never looked for strength. Now they were deep in the old section of the palace, where the original structure met newer additions. The tunnels here were narrower, darker, and according to Chris, less monitored. The Regarians had built their security around the assumption that threats came from outside, not from within. "Stop," Chris whispered suddenly, her hand shooting out to grab Jake's arm. He froze. In the darkness ahead, he could barely make out the corridor, let alone whatever danger she detected. "Security sensor," she breathed, pointing to a spot on the wall that looked exactly like every other spot on the wall to Jake. "Electromagnetic field. It's active. Can we go around it?" "No need. Watch." She pulled a small device from her pocket, something that looked like a lipstick tube. She clicked it once, and Jake felt a strange tingling sensation wash over him. "EM disruptor. Creates white noise in the electromagnetic spectrum. The sensor can't detect us while it's active. But it only lasts 3 minutes, and it'll show up on security logs as a glitch. We need to move fast." She set off down the corridor at a pace that made Jake nervous. He had a flashlight, but Chris had told him to keep it on the dimmest setting. Too much light might be noticed by patrol cameras. So he followed her through near darkness, trusting her completely. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. "Left here," Chris whispered at a junction. "Guard station 60 meters ahead. 2 guards, I can hear their breathing. One is watching a game on his datapad, the other is half asleep." "How can you possibly know that?" "The one watching the game keeps making small excited sounds. His heartbeat spikes every few seconds. The other one's breathing is slow and deep. REM patterns." She smiled slightly. "People think security is about cameras and sensors. Really, it's about understanding human behavior. Or Regarian behavior in this case." They waited in the shadows while Chris listened to the guards' patterns. After 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, she nodded. "No. They just changed shifts. Both are distracted with the handoff reports." They slipped past the guard station, and Jake didn't breathe normally again until they were around the next corner. His heart was pounding so hard he was surprised Chris couldn't hear it. Then again, she probably could. The archive entrance was hidden behind what looked like a maintenance panel. Chris ran her fingers over it until she found a seam that Jake couldn't even see. "Biometric lock," she murmured. "But it's old. They upgraded to retinal scans in the newer sections, but down here they still use fingerprints. So we're stuck." "Not quite." She pulled out another device, this one looking more like a medical scanner. "This reads the residual oils left by fingerprints. I've been collecting samples from Voritha's favorite brandy glasses for weeks." She pressed the scanner against the lock panel. "The prince loves his evening drinks. Never wears gloves. Very careless of him. There was a soft beep and the panel slid open. Jake stared at her in amazement. "You're terrifying. You know that, right?" "Thank you," Chris said cheerfully. "Now comes the hard part." The archive was huge, floor to ceiling with data storage units that glowed faintly in the darkness. The air was cool and dry, probably climate controlled to preserve the information. Jake could see his breath forming small clouds. "The files we need are in the restricted section," Chris said. "Back corner, third tier. But there are pressure plates on the floor. I can feel the slight give in the tiles." "Of course there are," Jake muttered. "Because this wasn't already difficult enough." Chris was already moving, stepping carefully on specific tiles. Jake followed exactly in her footsteps, not trusting his own judgment at all. One wrong step and they'd trigger an alarm that would bring every guard in the palace running. They reached the restricted section without incident. The files were stored in old-fashioned physical data chips, the kind that needed direct access to read. Jake was surprised Vorith kept anything in such an outdated format until Chris explained. Electronic files can be hacked remotely. Physical storage can only be accessed in person. It's actually more secure in some ways. She turned to Jake. "This is your part. I can get us here, but I can't read visual data. You need to access the files and download everything you can." Jake pulled out the portable reader Chris had given him earlier. His hands were shaking slightly as he started inserting data chips and copying their contents. The first few were routine administrative records, nothing interesting. Then he hit the restricted files. "Oh no," he breathed. "What is it?" "It's all here. Communications with the Purity Front going back 3 years. Financial records showing massive weapons purchases. And Chris." He scrolled through the files, his stomach sinking. "There's a plan. They're calling it Operation Ascension." "What's the target?" Jake's mouth went dry. "Earth's orbital defense platforms. They're planning to use the Cultural Technology Exchange, the one that's part of our marriage treaty, to install malware in our systems. Not to steal information. To shut down the defenses entirely." "Why would they want Earth's defenses down?" "Because..." Jake kept reading, each line making him feel sicker. "Because the Purity Front has been building a fleet in secret. Hidden in an asteroid field outside Regarian space. Once Earth's defenses are down, they're planning a full invasion. They'll take the outer colonies first, then move toward Earth itself." Chris's face had gone pale, her crystalline skin losing its color. "When?" 2 weeks after our wedding ceremony. The malware needs time to spread through Earth's networks." Jake looked up from the reader. "Chris, this isn't just about humiliating Earth. Your brother is planning genocide. The files estimate millions of casualties in the first wave alone." "Download everything," Chris said, her voice hard. "Every file, every communication, every piece of evidence. We need proof that can't be denied." Jake worked as fast as he could, copying data chip after data chip. Some of the files were encrypted, but he grabbed those too. Earth's intelligence people could crack the encryption later. What mattered was getting the evidence out. He was on the last chip when Chris suddenly grabbed his arm. "Stop. Someone's coming. I need 30 more seconds." "We don't have 30 seconds. Multiple footsteps. Guard patrol heading this way." She pulled him away from the storage units. "We need to hide. Now." They ducked behind a row of storage units just as lights flooded the archive. Jake pressed himself against the cold metal, barely breathing. Through a gap in the units, he could see 4 Regarian guards entering the room, their weapons drawn. "Sector 7 clear," one of them said into a communicator. "Moving to Sector 8. They were doing a full sweep. Jake and Chris were trapped. Chris leaned close to Jake's ear, her whisper barely audible even to him. "When they reach that corner, we run for the exit. Stay low, move quiet, and whatever happens, don't stop. What if they see us? Then we hope you're a fast runner." The guards moved methodically through the archive, checking each section. Jake watched them get closer and closer to where he and Chris were hiding. His heart was pounding so loud he was sure they'd hear it. Then Chris moved. She grabbed his hand and pulled, and they were running. Behind them, someone shouted. Footsteps thundered after them. Jake heard the crackle of energy weapons powering up. They burst into the corridor, Chris leading even though she couldn't see. She took turns without hesitation, her mental map of the palace perfect even at a full sprint. Jake struggled to keep up, his lungs burning. "Stop. By order of the crown." "Not a chance." They kept running. Chris pulled him into a side passage, then another, then down a narrow stairwell that Jake barely saw in time to avoid falling. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. "Almost there," Chris gasped. Service exit 50 meters. They burst through a door and into the night air. The palace gardens stretched before them, dark and full of hiding places. Chris pulled Jake into a dense cluster of plants and they crouched there trying to quiet their breathing. Guards poured out of the service exit, spreading out to search the grounds. Jake could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their search pattern. Did we get it? Chris whispered. The data? Jake checked his pocket. The portable reader was still there, intact. Yeah, we got it. Then this was worth it. She was quiet for a moment, listening to the guards search. Jake, once we reveal this information, there's no going back. Vorith will deny everything. It'll be our word against a prince's. We have evidence. We have data that we obtained through what amounts to breaking and entering. A good lawyer will argue it's inadmissible or fabricated. She turned toward him. Are you ready for that fight? Jake thought about the files he'd read. The casualty estimates. The detailed invasion plans. The cold calculation in every document about how many humans would die in the first strikes. Yeah, he said. I'm ready. Question is, what do we do now? Chris smiled, fierce and determined. Now, we get this evidence to people who can't be bought or intimidated. And then we crash my own wedding and expose my brother in front of the entire Galactic Council. That's a terrible plan. You have a better one? Jake watched the guards searching the gardens, getting closer to where they were hiding. Not even a little bit. Let's do it. The wedding ceremony was supposed to be the social event of the decade. Representatives from over 60 worlds had packed into the Grand Council chamber. Their various forms of formal were creating a rainbow of colors and styles that would have been beautiful if Jake hadn't been so terrified. He stood at the altar in a suit that had cost more than his first car, specially tailored to human proportions. Beside him, Chris wore a traditional Rigarian wedding gown that sparkled like she was made of diamonds. To everyone watching, they probably looked like the strangest couple in the galaxy. The ugly human and the blind princess, united in a marriage that was equal parts political necessity and cosmic joke. What the audience didn't know was that Jake had a data chip in his pocket containing enough evidence to bring down the Rigarian royal family. What they also didn't know was that Council Arbiter Denna, the highest legal authority in the Galactic Council, had spent the last 3 days reviewing every bite of that evidence. Tom stood in the front row of the human delegation, looking like he might throw up. He knew what was about to happen. So did a select few others scattered throughout the crowd. But most of the guests were just here for the spectacle. Prince Vorith sat in the place of honor, his crystalline skin practically glowing with satisfaction. He looked like someone who'd just won the lottery and solved world hunger in the same day. Jake wanted to punch that smug expression right off his face. The officiant, an ancient being whose species Jake couldn't even identify, began the traditional ceremony. The words washed over Jake without really registering. He was too busy watching Vorith, waiting for the moment when everything would fall apart. Chris squeezed his hand. She couldn't see the crowd, but Jake knew she could hear everything. The whispers, the barely concealed laughter, the comments about how generous Prince Vorith was to marry his poor blind sister to a human. Every insult, every condescending word, she heard it all. You okay? Jake whispered. Never better, she whispered back. Just waiting for the fun part. The ceremony reached its midpoint. The officiant was explaining the terms of the alliance, the trade agreements, the cultural exchanges. Everything sounded so official and proper. No one mentioned that those cultural exchanges were designed to install malware in Earth's defense systems. Then Arbiter Denna stood up. The chamber went silent. You didn't interrupt a royal wedding. You especially didn't interrupt when you were the arbiter of the Galactic Council. Denna was old, even by galactic standards, and her word was literally law across 100 worlds. Forgive the interruption, Denna said, her voice carrying across the chamber without any amplification. But this council has become aware of information that must be addressed before this union can proceed. Prince Vorith's expression didn't change, but Jake saw his skin flicker slightly. A sign of stress in Rigarians. The prince stood smoothly. Arbiter Denna, this is highly irregular. What information could possibly require interrupting a state ceremony? Information regarding a conspiracy to commit acts of war against member species of this council. The chamber erupted. Voices rose in shock and confusion. Delegates turned to each other, demanding explanations. The Rigarian nobles looked outraged at the accusation. Vorith's voice cut through the noise. This is absurd. On what grounds do you make such a claim? On these grounds. Denna gestured and holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber. Jake recognized the files he'd downloaded. Communications. Financial records. Invasion plans. Every piece of evidence he and Chris had risked their lives to obtain. The crowd's reaction was immediate and loud. Jake heard gasps, angry shouts, and what sounded like several delegates calling for security. The display showed everything in clear detail. The Purity Front. The secret fleet. The malware hidden in the cultural exchange technology. The planned invasion of Earth's colonies. And through it all, communications directly from Prince Vorith's private servers. This is a fabrication. Vorith shouted, his skin darkening with rage. These files are clearly forged by someone attempting to sabotage our alliance with Earth. The files were authenticated by 3 independent analysis teams, Denner replied calmly. The encryption keys match your personal security protocols, Prince Vorith. The timestamps are verified. This is not a fabrication. Vorith turned on Jake and Chris, his expression furious. You did this. You broke into restricted areas, stole private data. We exposed a plot to commit genocide, Jake interrupted. Yeah, we broke some rules doing it. But those files show you were planning to kill millions of people. I had nothing to do with the Purity Front. Yes, I have been in contact with various political groups, that's normal diplomacy. You authorized weapons shipments, Chris said, her voice clear and strong. She stepped forward, and even though she couldn't see her brother, she faced him with perfect accuracy. You provided intelligence on Earth's defense systems. You personally designed the malware that was supposed to shut down their orbital platforms. Your signature is on every authorization, Vorith. You can't even read the files, sister. You're blind. No, Chris said. I just see things differently than you do. For instance, I can hear that your heart rate is elevated to 140 beats per minute. I can smell the stress hormones your body is producing. I can feel the electrical discharge of your nervous system spiking. She smiled coldly. You're terrified, brother. And you should be. Vorith looked around the chamber, searching for support. But the other Rigarian nobles were backing away from him. No one wanted to be associated with treason against the Galactic Council. This whole marriage was a setup, Vorith said desperately. From the beginning. They manipulated me. You manipulated yourself, Arbiter Dennis said. You saw Ambassador Matthews as weak because of his appearance. You saw Lady Chris as helpless because of her disability. You underestimated both of them, and that underestimation led directly to your exposure. Security forces were moving into position around Vorith now. The prince looked around wildly, and for a moment Jake thought he might try to run. But there was nowhere to go. He was surrounded by delegates who just learned he'd planned to start a war. Take him into custody, Denna ordered. Prince Vorith of the Rigarian Empire, you are charged with conspiracy to commit acts of war against Council member species, trafficking in weapons of mass destruction and violations of the Galactic Peace Accords. As guards moved to arrest him, Vorith turned one last time to Chris. You've destroyed our family. You've humiliated our entire species in front of the Council. No, Chris said quietly. You did that yourself when you decided Rigarian superiority mattered more than peace. When you thought beauty was more important than integrity. When you forgot that strength comes in many forms. They took him away. The chamber was chaos, delegates shouting questions, news feeds broadcasting to 100 worlds, everyone trying to process what they just witnessed. Arbiter Denna raised her hand for silence. It took several minutes, but eventually the noise died down. The marriage contract between Ambassador Matthews and Lady Chris remains valid, if both parties still wish to proceed, she announced. The alliance between Earth and the Rigarian Empire is too important to dissolve over the actions of one corrupt individual. However, the terms will need to be renegotiated in good faith. She turned to Jake and Chris. The question is, do you wish to continue with this union? Jake looked at Chris. Over the past weeks, she'd become his partner in every way that mattered. She was brilliant, brave, and absolutely terrifying when she wanted to be. She trusted him with her secrets, with her safety, with her life. And somewhere along the way, he'd stopped thinking of her as a political arrangement and started thinking of her as someone he couldn't imagine being without. I want to continue, he said. If she'll have me. Chris turned toward him, and even though her eyes couldn't focus on his face, it felt like she was looking right into his soul. My brother said I couldn't see how ugly you are, Jake. But the truth is, I see you better than anyone else ever could. I see your courage when you agreed to help me investigate your own ally. I see your integrity when you risked everything to expose the truth. I see your kindness in the way you've never once treated me as lesser because of my blindness. She reached out and found his hand. And Jake? What I see is beautiful. Not in the superficial way my people measure beauty, but in the way that actually matters. You're beautiful because of who you are, not what you look like. Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen. All his life he'd been average. Average looks, average grades, average everything. And here was this incredible woman, royalty of an empire that valued physical perfection above all else, telling him he was beautiful because of his character. I accept, Chris said formally. I'll marry you, Jake Matthews. Not because Earth needs an alliance and not because my brother thought I was too broken to deserve better. I'll marry you because you're exactly who I want. The chamber erupted in applause. Not mocking this time but genuine. Even species that had been whispering about the ugly human and the blind princess were cheering now. The officiant, who'd been standing awkwardly to the side during the whole confrontation, cleared his throat. Then by the power vested in me by the Galactic Council, I pronounce you married. May your union bring peace and prosperity to both your peoples. Jake and Chris sealed their vows with a kiss, and the applause grew louder. Tom was wiping his eyes in the front row. Even some of the Rigarian nobles looked genuinely happy. As they walked back down the aisle together, Chris leaned close to Jake. You know this is going to be complicated, right? Rigarian politics is going to be a mess for years. Earth and my people have a lot of trust to rebuild. I know, Jake said. But we just took down a conspiracy, exposed a traitor, and stopped a war. I think we can handle some complicated politics. Also, Chris added with a smile, you're going to have to learn Rigarian formal customs. And meet my extended family. And deal with the fact that half the nobility thinks you're hideously ugly. As long as you don't think that. Jake, Chris said, squeezing his hand. I think you're perfect. They left the chamber to start their new life together. The ugly human and the blind princess, who'd proven that real strength had nothing to do with appearance, and true vision had nothing to do with sight. Prince Vorith had been right about one thing. Chris couldn't see how Jake looked. But that had never mattered at all. Because she saw everything that was actually important. And in the end that made all the difference.